What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Draft Report. In today's video, we are going to be doing an SEC full breakdown and preview for the upcoming 2024 season. Before we get to that, I just want to discuss a few things about the lack of content here. Obviously, I'm a draft-based channel, and I put a lot of work into the draft for the 6-7 months leading up to it, and just felt that I need a little break. I'm not big into summer scouting just because I do want to watch the guys in their final season and not really project what they've done the years before. It's good to watch that film, but it's more important what they do in that final year to really get the full grasp of the player. So I'm not big into summer scouting and stuff like that. So just haven't been watching much film on this 2025 class, honestly. But I am gearing up. I'm ready for this 2024 football season to start. And I figured I'd change my content up a little bit here and just kind of preview the college football season, go through the 4 major conferences, maybe do a playoff preview, maybe do newcomers. I don't know. A lot of stuff we could do with college football. But even though I love the draft, I love football just as a whole and wanted to put some content out there on my predictions and what I think is going to happen in this upcoming season and just give you guys a breakdown. So I just wanted to discuss that. We are going to be just going through the entire conference here. It's going to be a longer video, but I hope you stick with it, and thank you for watching. I know the content hasn't been very frequent lately. So we get it started. Number 16 team. We're just going to talk about the teams first. We go to Vanderbilt. Pretty self-explanatory. Just not much talent on this team. They had their leading receiver last year, I think, had like 360 yards, and he's gone. Their top 3 leading receivers are all gone. So major talent drain offensively. And they were also 0 of 8 last year. So not a ton going right for Vandy. They do have their leading rusher, Cedric Alexander, and their leading tackler, Langston Patterson, coming back. CJ Taylor's a solid corner. But if those are your 3 best players, those guys aren't All-American level talents. Those guys aren't even all-conference level talents. And you need a couple of those guys at least to even be close to competing in the SEC. And they just don't have that level of talent. To go along with that, they have a very tough schedule this year, as we'll get into. Key additions, I do want to highlight Nate Johnson. Former 4-star, University of Utah, has been sitting behind Cam Rising for, I think, the last 2 years, and just never really got his chance, but I think he's a guy that's talented and could maybe blow up here at Vanderbilt. Maybe he takes a year here and then transfers somewhere else, but I like the high upside swing there. Randon Fontenette, 4-star safety from TCU, another guy, didn't get much time there as their team has been very good the last couple years, but should have a chance for a lot of playing time here at Vanderbilt. Eli Stowers, former 5-star, I believe, at Texas A&M as a quarterback. Maybe he was a 4-star, but then never really worked out at quarterback. Switched to tight end, and then transferred to New Mexico State last year, where he kind of went off. So now he's back in the SEC trying to prove himself. So I like those additions. But it's not going to be enough. They start off first at home against Virginia Tech, which is a winnable game, but I think VTech's going to be solid this year, and I don't see them pulling that one out. Alcorn State and Georgia State, they should win those games, along with Ball State later in the schedule. Then you get into SEC play. I just don't see any wins on this schedule. I mean, Missouri, Alabama, Texas, LSU, Tennessee, I'd say those are all guaranteed losses. And then the 2, Kentucky and Auburn, are teams that are, maybe beatable, but they're in their environments at Jordan-Hare and at Kentucky. Those are tough places to play, so I don't see them pulling that out. South Carolina is the only one I could see them winning just because it's at home, but I think South Carolina is a way more talented team. So I don't see Vandy getting a win this year. They went 0-8 last year, and I see that trend continuing, but I hope they can pull out at least one win so they don't go 0-16. But we go to the next team, Mississippi State. This is a team that I think is on the up and up. Jeff Libby's in from Oklahoma, a good offensive mind, a guy that should have a high-powered offensive attack in the future, but I think it's a couple years away. Major losses here with Will Rogers, who's a good quarterback, Jaquavios Marks, who was a good running back, leading rusher for them last year. DeCamerion Richardson was a talented corner, kind of do-it-all guy, playmaker, and he went in the 5th round, I want to say, so losing him's tough. And then a lot of transfers coming in. Jeff Libby kind of overhauled that entire offense. I think there's only like 2 or 3 returning starters. Everyone else is projected to be a transfer on that. So it might be a little bit of a tough ride to start the season. I think by the end of the year, they could have a little more continuity and get that passing attack going. I think their defense could be decent with their guys returning. Corey Elliting, JP Pavis, leading 2 tacklers, I believe, from last year. Not superstars by any means, but solid guys. And then you're adding guys like Cameron Ball, Blake Shapen, Stone Blanton in the transfer portal. I'm interested to see how Shapen does in the SEC. 2 years ago, he was at Baylor as a true freshman, got thrust in as the starting quarterback, and ended up leading them to the Big 12 title. They almost made the playoff. I mean, there's some talent in there, but the last couple of years have been a little rough for him. So interested to see how that goes for Shapen in the SEC. And then Cameron Ball, tight end for Buffalo, Stone Blanton, a linebacker from South Carolina, both guys that were 4-star transfers and have potential. But we get to the schedule. I think Arizona State's going to be a tough test. I know Arizona State's not great, but going to their place, I think they're going to be better than they were last year. I mean, they gave Washington a run for their money last year, and they're a better team than they were then. So that's not a gimme win, but I do think they pull that one out. I think they win all their non-conference games, but then you get into the heart of that SEC schedule at Texas, at Georgia, at Tennessee, at Ole Miss. Those are all losses for sure. Home against Missouri, that's a loss, I think. Your real winnable games are probably Florida and Arkansas and maybe A&M just because it's at home, but I don't see them winning that A&M game. Florida, I don't see them winning that one either. Early in the season, it's going to be tough for them to get adjusted that quickly with that many transfers. So I do think they pull out an Arkansas win, maybe just because I don't think this team is bad enough to go 0-8, but that schedule is brutal. So they could be an 0-8 team. I think they're a solid team, but that it's the SEC's tough, and they are lacking talent against most of those teams. So disappointing season for the Bulldogs there. We got on number 14, Arkansas Razorbacks. I think they're an interesting team. They have good talent returning, but they also lost a lot. KJ Jefferson was a guy who's very good, dual threat guy, very tough to bring down. Maybe not the most refined passer, but as a runner, he was solid. I think he was a top quarterback in the SEC last year. Losing him's tough, especially when you're replacing him with Talon Green, who's a guy, 11 touchdowns to 11 picks last year at Boise State. Not super encouraging numbers there. He does show some dual threat ability, a little under 500 yards on the ground last year. So there's talent to bank on there, especially on the ground. Xavion Sori, I really like that transfer. Former 5-star from Georgia, never really got playing time there, but it's tough to really blame him for that. Georgia's so stacked, so bringing in a former 5-star could be big for them. Jaquindon Jackson is a guy from Utah. I think he had 800 yards on the ground last year, so he's a talented guy. So losing Raheem Rocket Sanders, who was a guy who was very talented, going into last year was viewed as kind of like a second-round pick, a running back, and just didn't really live up to that hype, but that talent is in there somewhere, so they needed to replace him. That's a big loss. And then they have good returning players. I mean, Andrew Armstrong, a guy that's a preseason All-SEC. I think he had like 800 yards receiving last year. Landon Jackson's a guy who could go very high in the draft. He's a very talented player. All-SEC defensive lineman, or preseason All-SEC defensive lineman nod for him. Joshua Braun's a guy who could potentially be an All-SEC guy as well. He's talented, good player, but I think they lost more than they brought in, and that's going to lead to them having another rough season. I know they went 1-7 last year, and I think that might be on the horizon again. A tough game to start the year, or after the Pine Bluff game, which they better win, but Oklahoma State, at Oklahoma State, I don't know if they have what it takes to beat a team like that, especially with Ollie Gordon running the way he runs. I don't know if they have what it takes to stop that high-powered offense. So that's going to be a tough game. That's going to be very telling for how their season goes. I think they pull that one off, and you could be seeing a 3-4 win SEC team. But if they lose that game, that's going to show some signs that they're really not ready to compete in this SEC this year. They should beat UAB and Louisiana Tech as their easy non-conferences. But then, again, you get into that tough SEC schedule at Auburn and then neutral site against A&M versus Tennessee. their road games aren't brutal this year. I mean, at Auburn, at Mississippi State, at Missouri, that's not super tough. I do think they lose all of those, but all of those are outside of Missouri and A&M, I would say. The A&M ones, that's always a close game that it seems like they always lose. Auburn and Mississippi State, those are both winnable games, but I think they're I just think the Auburn playing at Jordan Hare is going to be tough for them to win. And then I just think Mississippi State gets one at some point, and at home, Talon Green playing with the Cowbells. Like, I don't know. I feel like that's a game that's going to go to Mississippi State. And I had to give Mississippi State a win in there somewhere. I just felt like they're not an 0-8 team. So I chose Arkansas. And then, I mean, man, you look at the games at home, Tennessee, LSU, Ole Miss, Texas. Getting them one of those was tough. Saying they're going to beat LSU is tough. I just feel like Mississippi State, Arkansas isn't bad enough to go 0-8, but it's really tough to predict a win on that schedule. I do think it comes against either Auburn, LSU, or Mississippi State if they do pull out a win. But we'll see. I think it's going to be tough for this team to really contend with the lack of talent they have and the amount they lost this offseason, especially with Talon Green. I'm not the biggest fan of him coming in. Number 13, South Carolina. Another team, I don't hate them on paper, but it's just this SEC is brutal and they have a tough schedule. Nick Harbor is a guy, the sky's the limit for that dude. He is one of the freakiest athletes I've ever seen. He's like 230 pounds and he like set his high school state record in the 100-yard dash. That dude's insane. He could be the next like Megatron or something. But I think he might need a year. He might not totally break out until next year. Debo Williams is someone who I think can make an all-SEC team. He's super talented. I think he had like 120 tackles last year or something insane like that. And then they're bringing back a lot on defense. So I think their defense could be solid, but maybe not the best. But really where I see the problem is the amount of offensive juice they lost. Spencer Rattler, Xavier Legette, Juice Wells, those are your three best offensive players that were really very good players. I know Rattler gets a little bit of hate, but behind that offensive line, he showed a lot of promise. And I mean, he got sacked like 46 times or something because the line was so bad, and he still looked good. Legette was a guy you could just hand the ball off to, and he'd go for 20 yards. You could also just toss it up to him. As a college player, as a college connection, Rattler and Legette were great, and losing that's going to be very tough, especially because they weren't a team that won that many games last year, even with those guys. I do think bringing in Raheem Rocket Sanders, who I talked about in the Arkansas slide, could be very good for them. He's a very good runner. But we get into the schedule. You get that Old Dominion, but then they start SEC play quick. They play at Kentucky week 2. That's probably a loss. At home against LSU, I mean, maybe you win that one, but probably not. With a new quarterback coming in, it's either going to be Robbie Ashford or Sellers. I think Sellers is the more talented guy, but I also think Sellers needs some time. He's that dual threat kind of high upside swing, and I think Ashford is maybe a little more ready. But the stuff I've seen from Ashford, I don't know if he can really be a true SEC quarterback. So that quarterback battle, I don't think either of those guys are going to be ready to go at Kentucky, at home against LSU. Those are going to be tough games. And then you get Akron. That should be a win, along with Wofford later in the year. But then you get into a brutal stretch. At home against Ole Miss, at Alabama, at Oklahoma. They're not winning any of those games, I don't think. I think A&M... I had a tough time with that game. A&M's the more talented team, obviously, but I feel like the Aggies always just blow a stupid game, and I felt like at South Carolina, kind of in the middle of the season, like that's just one that I feel like A&M's going to drop, but I feel like South Carolina at home might pull that one out once they kind of get a little more accustomed with their quarterback situation, and they should beat Vandy, but then you end versus Missouri and then at Clemson. I don't see many wins on that schedule. Even predicting 2 is tough for them because of the stretches they have. Vandy should be an easy win, but then your next easiest game is at home against A&M, which is a very tough game. So wouldn't shock me if they go 1-7, but felt like they deserved a second win in there. We get to Kentucky, and I feel like I say this about every team, but I really mean it about Kentucky. This is a team that I think has a lot of talent, and I think is a very good team. I think you put this team in the ACC, and they're a 6-win team, 7-win team in conference. But just against this schedule, there is not many wins on this brutal schedule. It's it's going to be very tough for them. I think I'm a big fan of their defense overall. Deion Walker is one of the biggest freaks in college football. He's like 6'6", 350 pounds, and moves like he's probably 100 pounds lighter. I mean, the dude is a freak. He reminds me a ton of Jordan Davis. I think he could be that same level of impact. I think he could win. I forget all the names of the awards, but the award for the best defensive lineman in the country, I think he's that level of talent. So he's an absolute freak. You bring back him and I forget his name, but their edge rusher. They were their top 2 sack leaders last year. I think they both had like 7.5 sacks. So you bring back both of them, along with De'Aric Jackson, who is a leading tackler from last year, good linebacker. I think your front 7 can go and compete with anyone, especially adding a guy like Jimon Dumas Johnson from Georgia, who is a talented player there. And just, again, like all these Georgia guys, couldn't get his shine. But at a place like Kentucky in a real role. I mean, he was a former blue chip prospect and a guy that definitely could be a real contributor for them. So their front 7 is going to be very good. And I think their corner is going to be very good. Maxwell Harrison was a guy who last year was a all SEC bid. And I mean, you lose Andrew Phillips, who is a great slot guy for you. But I think their defense, talent-wise, can match up with a lot of teams, but I just worry about the offensive talent. Devin Leary was someone I was a fan of. He was good last year. Ray Davis, an older prospect, but I think when you just look at the film, he's a very good runner, especially for the college level. So you bring in Chip Trainum, who I think can replace him a little bit, but then Brock Vandegrift, I'm interested to see how that goes. I know Georgia fans kind of liked what they saw from him, but I'm waiting to see if he's really a true SEC level quarterback. So that's just kind of where it leads me to that 3-win place. I think they pull off South Carolina. I think they win their non-conferences, even though that Louisville game is going to be tough at the end of the year. But then, even though it's at home, Georgia's a loss. At Ole Miss, that's a loss. At home against Auburn, that's a toss-up. But I do think Auburn just pulls that off because they have a little more offensive talent. At Tennessee, it's tough to say they're going to win that one. At Texas is tough. Vandy, they should win. And then one that I just feel like they're a talented team, and Florida is just a weird team. I think they do go in to Florida, go into the swamp, and pull off an upset. I have a feeling that's going to happen. And just because I wanted to give this Kentucky team 3 wins, I felt like they're that talented of a team. But like every team, when you don't have freak show talent at every position on the field, you're just not matching up with half the teams in the SEC. I mean, Deion Walker might be the best player in the SEC this season. He might be a top 3 pick in the draft. But you have to have that level of talent at almost every position, it seems like, to beat a team like Georgia, to beat an Alabama, to beat a Ole Miss, or beat a Texas. And there's just, this conference is very tough, and you have to have more than just one side of the ball. And I think that's Kentucky's problem. I don't think their offense is going to be very good. But I like what Stoops is building there. I think for a basketball school like Kentucky, he's making them somewhat known in the football realm, and it's impressive. So we go number 11, Florida. This is a team that could legit go 4-8, and you would say they're a top 25 team in the country. This schedule, especially the second half, is the most insane stretch I've ever seen. We're going to start with the schedule because I'm talking about it before we go to the players. Just look at the last 5 weeks. At Georgia, at Texas, home against LSU, home against Ole Miss, at Florida State. That's 3 of the top 5 teams from last year, along with Ole Miss, who's going to be a preseason top 10 team, and along with LSU, who's probably a preseason top 15 team. That is a insane stretch. Not to mention that earlier in the season, you have to go to Tennessee, you have to play A&M, and you have to play Miami. I mean, that is 9 teams that could all end the season in the top 25. 9 teams that are probably all going to be ranked in the preseason top 25 in one schedule. That is insane. So I think this team, their record is not going to define their season. I think if this team can pull off 5 wins in the SEC, if this team makes a bowl game, that's a success. With where they're at a program right now, I think if Billy Napier can pull off a bowl game this year, his job might be safe. That's how crazy this schedule is. But we get to the team. Graham Mertz, He's okay. But if he doesn't play well, DJ Lagway is waiting in the wings, and Lagway is a super, super talented kid and a guy that could win Heisman's in the future. I mean, he's that good. So I think he could be ready if Mertz isn't on his game. And then Jason Marshall, solid corner for them. Montreal Johnson, leading rusher, coming back. Or sorry, not leading rusher. Second leading rusher behind Trevor Etienne, who left for their rivals Georgia. So that's going to sting in that game. He was a great player for them. Obviously, his brother is a stud in the NFL. And then losing Pearsall as well. Pearsall was one of my draft crushes. I really liked him. I think him getting picked in the first round was fine. A lot of people didn't like that, but Pearsall was a stud, especially at the college level. He was awesome. And then Princely Umanemalian. I'm not going to act like I know how to say that name, but he was a good player for them. Former 5-star, I want to say, but he was one of the higher rated transfers in the portal and went to Ole Miss. So losing him is tough. But you bring in a lot of talent. Cormani McLean, obviously former 5-star, went to play for Dion, didn't work out. Jason Zandamela, another former 5-star from USC, I want to say. Yeah, he was a 5-star there. Elijah Badger, a guy, 700 yards last year at ASU, so I think he can replace Pearsall to some extent, but not really. Pearsall is very good. So you're replacing talent pretty well there. I think their quarterback duo of McLean and Jason Marshall could be pretty good. But again, I like to match up to even go 500 in the SEC against this schedule would be very impressive. So I do see them pulling off A&M in the swamp. I see them winning at Mississippi State, and I see them winning LSU. But even that's tough. I mean, they're going to be favored in one game on their schedule. I think maybe they're favored in the Kentucky game, and they're favored in the Mississippi State game. But I think A&M, that's probably an upset. LSU, that's probably an upset, and every other game on there is a crazy game to win. I mean, it's a gaudy schedule, and it's I feel for Florida fans because they're going to go 5-7 and fire their coach. It's going to be like we didn't even play that bad. They could hang with all these teams and still lose. So. Very tough schedule for them. They could get into the playoffs with 8 wins, though. I guess that's the bright side is you don't really have to be awesome to be a top 12 team with that schedule. We go to number 10, the Auburn Tigers. If you don't know, this is my school. I think we are on the up and up, but I am not going to be biased and tell you that we're winning the national title this year. I think we're going to be okay. That's about it. I think rebuilding year for us, especially losing DJ James, Nehemiah Pritchett, Jalen Simpson. Our team was kind of built on that secondary last year, even though we allowed a 4th and 31 in the final game of the season. It was built on that secondary, that strong secondary with 3 draft guys, 2 guys that went in the 4th round with James and Pritchett, both to the Seahawks. Jalen Simpson went to the Colts, I believe, in like the 6th. But all 3 of those guys are uber talented, especially at the college level. So losing them is going to be tough, especially because we didn't bring in a ton of help in the secondary. So I think that's going to go from our biggest strength to their biggest weakness there. But they did improve on the other side. The biggest weakness from last year was the skill position talent, and they look to have improved that, especially through the freshman ranks with Cam Coleman and Perry Thompson, who are both 5-star recruits that could contribute year one, but also with Keandre Lambert-Smith, who was at Penn State, who was one of the top receiver transfers in the portal. So I think you lose out on that secondary ability, but you gain it back with some receiver ability. I think it equals out a little bit. Rico Walker, also a tight end from Maryland, that's pretty good. But you also have Rivaldo Fairweather, who was a All-SEC tight end, I believe, last year. And then Jarquez Hunter, who might be the best running back in the SEC, returning for his final season. Eugene Asante, a guy that could go in the first round of the draft, be ready for double-digit sacks this year. But yeah, it's tough for me to see a team with Peyton Thorne at the helm of quarterback and have them really go in and beat Georgia and go in and beat Alabama and Missouri. I mean, I don't think there's a team that plays 3 tougher road games than at Georgia, at Missouri, at Alabama. I do think they pull off the one at Kentucky, and I do think their home games aren't too tough with Arkansas, Oklahoma, A&M, and Vandy. I think they pull off a good amount of those at home. I think they go 3-1 at home, and probably 1-3 on the road. And 1-3 on the road, I mean, Kentucky they should win, but man, if they pull off one against Georgia, Missouri, or Alabama, Tumors would have Tumors would be crazy. So I think that's a pipe dream to win any of those games. And honestly, predicting them to win either of Oklahoma or A&M is probably going to be a tough game as well. So I think 4-4 in SEC's fair, very very light non-conference schedule. So I think 8-4 is a very safe bet for them. But I'm not going to be biased and sit here and tell you that they're going into Bama and winning, into Georgia and winning, into Missouri. They just don't have the talent right now to win those games. So 8-4 for the Auburn Tigers. Number 9, Oklahoma. They're a tough team to gauge because they're going from the Big 12, where it was kind of just air it out and you can win without having the trench play, to the SEC, where trenches matter a ton. And I think talent for talent outside of the trenches, they can match up with a lot of teams, but you get to that offensive line and that defensive line, and the talent there is just not what it needs to be, especially with losing a guy like Guyton and losing Dylan Gabriel. I don't think they have what it takes to really be a contender in the SEC. But I could be proven wrong. It's tough to know when you change conferences like that. Danny Stutzman, Billy Bowman, those are two great players on defense. Two guys that could be All-Americans this year. And the Jackson Arnold is a guy that super high upside, former 5-star, but I feel like he's going to need to adjust a little bit. I think there's going to be a learning curve to playing in the SEC in his first year and taking over the reins from Dylan Gabriel, who, say you want about his NFL talent, but as a college player, he's very good and was very good for Oklahoma last year. So losing him is going to be tough. They bring in Caden Woolard from Miami of Ohio, Deion Burks from Purdue. He was their leading receiver, I want to say, last year, and Demonic Williams from TCU. All of those guys were pretty highly rated 4-star transfers. And they brought in a decent amount of transfer talent, but again, the trenches are just not what they need to be. I think, and their secondary isn't very good either, outside of Bowman. But you look at their receiver talent, it's pretty good. You look at the quarterback position, it's talented. It's a question mark, though. And you look at their linebacker play, it's really good. I think you have the skill position talent on both sides of the ball to compete, but again, they might have the worst offensive line, defensive line combo outside of Vanderbilt, maybe in the entire conference. So very questionable there. So we'll see how that plays in the SEC. They have a weird non-conference schedule because they play 3 Division I teams with Temple, Houston, and Tulane. Very rare that they only play one non-big time school, right? I think that Tulane game is kind of a trap game because I think Tulane's going to be very good. Same with Houston. Those are not easy wins, but I do think they pulled them out. And then I think they kind of shocked the world and beat Tennessee and then beat Auburn. So I think they start the season 5-0, and people are going to be looking at them like, okay, going into the Red River rivalry with Texas, who's probably going to be undefeated at that point, like that's probably a top 10 matchup. But I think they get the doors blown off of them by Texas, going to be honest. They just don't have what it takes. I mean, again, I'm going to bring it up. Texas is very good in the trenches, and Oklahoma is not. And I think Texas could just pound the ball against that defense, and it might be ugly down there in the Cotton Bowl. South Carolina should be a win. At Ole Miss, at LSU, I think they lose those two. And then versus Alabama, I think they win. And then a very big upset. I think they go into Missouri, end of the season, and they kind of hurt Missouri's playoff chances there and go and beat them in Columbia. I think that's going to be a big game. Oklahoma just gives me kind of weird vibes as a team that's going to win some big games because of that talent, but they're going to lose some games they shouldn't because of the just the lack of trench play. And I guess looking at the schedule, they're not really losing any games they shouldn't. I mean, Texas, Ole Miss, Bama, LSU are probably all better teams than them, but I don't know. I think they could pull off some wins like Tennessee and like Missouri, but I just don't think they have what it takes to be a true contender. We get to number 8, Texas A&M. I am from a family of Aggies, so I know this team very well. They're another team like Oklahoma, just weird vibes. Every year it's the same thing with them. They have as much talent and depth as anyone. Their recruiting is always pretty good, but they just can't seem to put together a full season. They just can't seem to win the games they should, and Like they always pull out a weird win. So that's what when you look through the schedule, it's like they're losing to teams they shouldn't. They're beating teams they shouldn't. That's the vibe I get from this team. Connor Wegman is someone that's getting a little underrated in my opinion. Former 5-star. Every time he's played, he's been good. He's just been hurt a lot, and the injuries haven't been something that you would think would like come back. It's been like a broken ankle. It's like he's not injury prone. He just got rolled up on and had to miss half the season. Shamar Turner, a guy that could be an All-American, first-round pick type talent. Moose Muhammad, who's been very good for them in the past. And then I think the biggest addition, and this is really a guy that could turn this program on its head, Nick Scourton. I don't want to say he's the next Myles Garrett because Myles Garrett is Myles Garrett. But this dude is different. He's like 280 pounds and he moves like a running back or something. I mean, he has some freaky stuff going on, and he's in that Myles Garrett mold, I want to say, of guys that are insanely big and are insanely athletic that just shouldn't be able to move like they do. And I think this is a guy that could put up insane sack numbers. He could be the next in line behind Von Miller and Myles Garrett of top 5, top 3 picks, top 1 picks in the draft. I don't want to get too high on this guy, but man, you watch that Purdue film against the offensive line talent in the Big Ten. He led the conference in sacks as a junior, I believe, maybe even as a sophomore. And he comes to the SEC. I think this dude's a freak, and I don't want to be too low on him because he could be the number 1 pick next year. Say my Broncos are picking number 1. We already have Bo Nix. Shoot, we need an edge rusher. I don't know. I could see it. Cyrus Allen, a guy from Louisiana Tech, I think he put up like 800 yards there. Des Ricks, another freak athlete. Didn't really stick at Alabama, former 5-star, could have potential there. But then I don't think there's a team in the SEC that lost as much to the transfer portal as this team did. Walter Nolan, former 5-star, in that mold of Nick Scourton of freakishly big dudes who move insanely well. Another guy that could be a top 10 pick, Evan Stewart. I know he didn't seem to have the best relationship in the locker room with this team, but crazy talent. Every time he's on the field, he's very good. He's in that Wegman mold where he gets hurt a lot. But in that Oregon offense, I think he's going to explode. If you thought Troy Franklin was talented, just wait for Evan Stewart in that role. I think you could hear his name on night 1 of the draft as well. And then Aniyah Smith, not a guy I was big on in the draft process, but for a college player, he was a very good returner, very good gadget guy. So losing him's tough. Then we go through the schedule. I think the Notre Dame game kind of defines their season. If they're good enough to beat Notre Dame, I think they're a dark horse contender in the SEC. If they lose that game at home, I think you can write their chances of being anything in the SEC this year away. I think that's a big game for them, obviously, and one of the bigger non-conference games in the entire country. McNeese State should be a win, along with Bowling Green and New Mexico State. And then at Florida, again, this is a team I just get weird vibes from, and I think Elko's first big game on the road, I could see him losing that one in the swamp. Bowling Green, I said, was a win. Neutral site Arkansas is a win. And then again, they lose to Florida, maybe as a favorite, and then they go in home against Missouri. I think they kind of stop the Missouri hype train there and pull off that upset. And then at Mississippi State, they should win that one. Versus LSU, this is what I had as a win, and then I changed it because I just think LSU might be able to pull this one off. I know it's in Kyle Field, but I don't want to give them too much of a boost for their home environment. And again, they're a team that's going to lose some stupid games. South Carolina, they're going to win that game. I know they are, but I had to put it as a loss because it just feels like such an A&M loss. Because they're going to be, they're 7-1 going into this LSU game, and I just can see them losing that, like just going on anytime the hype gets too high for this school, it goes downhill fast, and I can see them losing a couple quick there. Versus LSU, at South Carolina, at Auburn, a tough environment to play in Auburn, and then they're going to come back and beat Texas. Something I'm very, I wouldn't say very confident, but something I'm pretty confident in is that A&M is definitely covering the spread that game and probably winning that game because the environment, of that game is going to be crazy. I know the schools have said, "Oh, we don't care. We're not rivals with each other," but that game's going to be crazy. And I think Texas is going to really get that SEC feeling coming into Kyle Field, and they're going to drop that game. But it's not going to mean much for A&M. Like every game, it seems like every year they have a big win at the end of the year, but it means nothing because they lose stupid games earlier in the year. So it's going to be the same thing, same old Aggies. 4-4 in the conference play. We get to LSU. They're a team that has, like every year, a ton of draft talent. Will Campbell might be the number one pick. Harold Perkins going to be a top, at least a first round pick, maybe a top 10 pick. Kyron Lacey, a guy that put up okay numbers and flashed even behind Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. I don't know why it says Brian Thomas cornerback back down there. Ignore that. But then they also add CJ Daniels and Xavier Thomas, who were 4-star transfers in the portal. So I like that. Daniels from Liberty, Xavier Thomas from Mississippi State, and then Jardin Gilbert from A&M. Good player for them. Just want to change the scenery with the coach leaving. And I mentioned how A&M is probably the biggest team that lost talent to the portal, and I don't think there's any debate that LSU lost the most talent to the draft. Jaden Daniels, Heisman winner. Malik Neighbors, he won the Biletnikoff, I'm pretty sure, right? Yeah. And then Brian Thomas Jr. led the nation in touchdowns. And I know they fed off of each other. Those stats helped because Daniels played with Thomas and vice versa. But yeah, 3 top 17 picks, right? Where did Thomas went 20th? So 3 top 20 picks, 2 of those being top 6 picks. No team lost that much talent. I'm sure of it. So that's going to be tough. And Garrett Nussmeier's good, but he's not Jaden Daniels, and that's really gonna hurt them. And I think again, big game at USC to start the year. Week 1's gonna have a lot of defining games in the SEC, but I think they pull that one off. Nichols, they're gonna win along with South Alabama, but then they play UCLA, so they play UCLA and USC. So that's gonna be tough. I think they pull both of those off because I don't think either of those teams are as good as they're kind of cracked up to be. I think they beat South Carolina. So they're rolling into this Ole Miss game at home, 5-0. You know Death Valley is going to be absolutely crazy. That's going to be game of the week for sure. Both teams should be undefeated at that point. That's going to be a big game, and I think they pull that off in Death Valley. I think they pull that off. I think Ole Miss is very talented offensively. But I think LSU has the defense to match up in a way. I think Harold Perkins could feast. Ole Miss, their weakness on offense is definitely that line, and I think Harold Perkins could have a field day there. And I think at that point, Nussmeier should be more comfortable, and it's at home. But then they're another team. I just don't think they can truly get it done. I think they go to Arkansas and lose. I have a feeling that that's going to be a trap game. They're going to be, I mean, after that Ole Miss win, I could see them being a top 5 team in the country because they are LSU. They have that prestige, and just laying an egg against Arkansas. It seems like LSU, the last couple years, have had all the talent in the world, and they just can't put it together. Brian Kelly dropped some stupid game in the middle of the schedule, and I think that's the one they drop. But that could also be the A&M game that they drop. I think they split those two for sure. So whichever way it works out. And then at Alabama, I hope they win. Or at home against Alabama, I hope they win, but I think they lose. At Florida, another game that gives me weird vibes. Florida should be better at that point in the season. Maybe Lagway's even starting at that point. So I think they dropped that one. But then they finish off strong with wins against Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. But again, I mean, I have them upsetting Ole Miss. I have them upsetting. I guess they're a better team than Oklahoma, but that's not an easy win. A&M is a toss-up game, so it's not like this. No team has an easy schedule. I mean, going 5-3 in the SEC is a very, very that's a good season for sure. So number 6, Tennessee, another 5-3 team, another tough schedule. James Pierce, I think he's the odds-on favorite outside of quarterbacks to be the number 1 pick. Squirrel White, a talented receiver for them. I think he led them in receiving, I want to say, last year. Brew McCoy, another talented receiver. He got hurt last year, but a guy that was up there in receiving, especially per game numbers. Holden Stays, a good tight end from Notre Dame. Lance Hurd, a former 5-star, I want to say, from LSU. And then Jordan Ross, the number 2 edge rusher in the recruiting class, who could provide talent year one. And him across from James Pierce is scary. But the major losses. Joe Milton, I don't know how to feel about going from him to Nico because they're both guys with huge arms and decent running ability. I think Milton is the freakier athlete, but I think Milton is one of the worst quarterbacks I've seen. He just doesn't know how to play the position, whether it's reading out passing lanes, whether it's being accurate with the ball, whether it's not throwing 3 picks a game. He's just not good at quarterbacking, but he's a freak show. So going from him to Nico, I think Nico will be better, obviously, in the future, but year one, we'll see. That's why I think they lose a game early to Oklahoma, just because I think Nico's going to take time to adjust. But you get into that heart of the schedule, I think he gets it going, he gets rolling, and they could start to win some games. Kamal Haddon, very, very good player. Got hurt last year, but went to the Chiefs in the draft, I want to say. Jalen Wright, one of my draft crushes. He was my number 1 running back, I believe. All you need to know, he is fast, and you lose a ton of speed losing him. So we get to the schedule. I think they have a pretty light non-conference here with Chattanooga at NC State. That's a trap game, but I think they pull it out. Versus Kent State, they should win that one, and then UTEP they'll win. So 4-0 in non-conference, and then their away games at Oklahoma, at Arkansas, at Georgia, at Vandy. Not super brutal. I mean, you can already kind of pencil in a Georgia loss, but then they could pull off those other 3. But I just think at Oklahoma, with Nico being in only his 4th game at that point, I think they lose that one. But then you have home games against Florida, Bama, Kentucky, Mississippi State. I think you could win those, besides the Bama one, obviously. So maybe they drop that. But yeah, 9-3 for them, 5-3 in conference. Not a bad season. I don't think it gets Heupel fired, but Tennessee fans will not be happy with that result, probably. But we go to number 5, Missouri, a team that I think is getting slightly overrated. Like, I get that Brady Cook and Luther Burden maybe is the best 1-2 combo. There's another school that I would probably put ahead of them later on the list. But Luther Burden, Brady Cook is a very good combo. Both guys that have chances at the Heisman, I'd say. And Eli Drunkowitz is a very good coach. I think he's got something rolling there in Columbia. But I just, kind of like Ole Miss, or not Ole Miss, kind of like Oklahoma, I just don't think their trenches are necessarily at that level, especially just their overall defense. I don't know. We'll see. But they also have a decently light schedule, as we'll get into. But their losses are tough. Darius Robinson, Ennis Rakestraw, Chris Abrams-Drain, those are 3 guys that were very, very important to that defense. And you lose them, and you replace them with guys like Williams Nwaneri. He was the number 1 edge rusher, and he's like, in a vacuum, he is a better player than Darius Robinson, but as a true freshman versus what Darius did last year, he's not going to compare. Toriano Pride, talented guy from Clemson, but he's not going to compare to what Rakestraw and Abrams-Drain did last year. And then you also lose Cody Schrader, who dark horse, I think he had like 1,200 rushing yards last year. He was like very good for them. So you lose him, but it's a running back. You can stomach that. Caden Green is a former 5-star, I believe, from Oklahoma. Yes. And then Chuck Hicks was their leading tackler last year, I believe. But really, I think you look at this team, if you take away Luther Burden and Brady Cook, which I know isn't a fair exercise, those are 2 awesome players, but you take them away and you say take away Georgia's 2 best players, the difference between 3 through 22 is exponential. Even though their 1-2 is up there with anyone in the country. I don't think they have the depth that these other teams do, and you're really, really relying on Burden and Cook staying healthy, which I hope they do, but it's a big risk, and if either of those guys go down, your season is screwed. So I do think they have a very light non-conference here with Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College, UMass. They go 4-0 in non-conference. They beat Vandy. That's 5 wins for sure. I think home against Auburn, they win that one. I think at South Carolina, at Mississippi State versus Arkansas, I think you have pretty much 8 or 9 guaranteed wins on that schedule, but you have to go into Kyle Field. You have to go into Bryant Denny. I think they lose both of those. I just don't think they're ready for those environments to go be that team that's a playoff level team. So I think they drop those, and then I have a bad feeling about them really pulling off a 10-win season. So I think they lose to Oklahoma. Maybe that loss comes to Auburn. Maybe that loss comes to Arkansas. But 9 wins just feels like what this team is. I think that gets them in the playoff. Maybe we'll see, but this team is slightly overrated. Everyone's kind of having them as their dark horse, but when everyone says they're underrated, that's kind of mean they're underrated. I don't think they're a 6-win, 7-win SEC team, but I'd love to be proven wrong. Number 4, Ole Miss, another team that's slightly overrated. I'm not going to lie, when I did my first run through of their schedule, I had them going 8-0, 7-1, something like that. I was like, this team's going to be good. But then I just had to look at it a little more, and I'm like, this team is slightly overrated. Jackson Dart, I don't like him, but he's a very good player. He could win the Heisman this year. Trey Harris, I don't know if you want to kill like 5 minutes of time, look up Trey Harris Texas A&M highlights from last year. Dude was insane. I was at that game live. I mean, he would catch everything. He caught literally everything. And I'm not gonna sit here and act like I watched every single game from him, but that one game I was like, this dude's freaking Calvin Johnson or something. This dude's insane. So I think he could break out and be a true big talent for them. Caden Priestcorn, probably the second best tight end in this class, I think, behind the Michigan guy. But then you add, I think their biggest weakness was in the trenches, especially on defense, and you add Walter Nolan and Princely Human. I can't say the name. Umanamalian. 2 guys that were absolute studs, especially Walter Nolan. He's going to just change the identity of that defense, in my opinion. I think that's a big get, a guy that could be a top 10 pick, which they haven't had on defense. They haven't had even a first-round pick on defense since Robert Nkemdiche, I don't think, unless I'm wrong there. But defense has not been their forte, especially under Lane Kiffin. So having an identity on defense that Walter Nolan and Princely can get after the quarterback will be big. Juice Wells from South Carolina, talented receiver. Add him with Trey Harris will be big. But man, the one thing I think this team, if they were able to keep Quinshon Judkins, could have really been a contender. But I'm not the biggest running back guy. Like, I just think they're overrated value-wise. But Quinshon, that dude's a freak, and he's going to go to Ohio State. And I know he'll be splitting with Travion Henderson, but he's going to blow up there at Ohio State. Dejon Anthony, Cedric Johnson, both late-round picks. So they're not losing much talent, and they're a team that was good last year. And I go through their schedule. It's very easy. All the games they have is wins. The only ones I can see them really dropping are maybe the Oklahoma game, but it's at home, and then maybe at Florida. But even at LSU, I think they probably maybe pull that one out. But I see a Lane Kiffin team, and I'm like, they're not getting 11 wins. They're not making the SEC championship. And I know that's bad. I'm just I want to see it to believe it. I think they're going to drop a stupid game like at LSU. And then at home against Georgia, I wanted them to win this game. I was like, Georgia's not going 8-0. But then I'm like, okay, Ole Miss is not beating Georgia. They have the better quarterback, but they don't even have the better quarterback. I don't know what I'm saying. Do they have more offensive talent? Probably not, and their defense is nowhere close. So it's like, as much as I wanted them to win that, it's not happening. So 10-2 gets them in the playoffs for sure. And once you get in the playoffs, who knows? Number 3 here, the Texas Longhorns. As you know earlier, I have them losing at Texas A&M. Longhorns fans are not going to be happy with that one. But they also lose at Georgia. I think that's a fair loss because it's at Georgia. Like, they're not winning that game. But then outside of that, their schedule's really not that tough, except week 2. Very tough non-conference at Michigan. But I'm a little lower on Michigan. They lost a ton of talent. I know it's like defending national champions, but they might be a little worse than they were last year for sure. But as I mentioned earlier, I said I think Missouri has maybe the second best 1-2 punch of this list. And I'm going to have to give that one spot to Quinn Ewers and Isaiah Bond. I think Burden is slightly better than Bond, but I think Ewers is better than Brady Cook. So, you're splitting hairs either way. Both super talented. And then Kelvin Banks, probably top 5 pick in the draft next year, protecting Quinn Ewers' blindside there. Anthony Hill Jr. was a stud as a true freshman last year, and no reason why he can't be an All-American this year. Amari Nyblack was good for Alabama. He comes to Texas in Sark's system, replacing JT Sanders, who I think is overrated. JT Sanders was great for them last year, so Nyblack can replace that. Matthew Golden, good player there. So yeah, you had talent, but I think it's gonna be tough for them. They're losing Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, Jonathan Brooks. That skill talent drain is comparable to LSU with Neighbors and Brian Thomas. So losing those three is going to be tough. But I like the fact they have viewers there, and their schedule really outside of that Georgia and A&M game isn't that tough. I think Oklahoma is decent, but they should win that. And then Florida, Arkansas, Kentucky, Vandy. I mean, it's pretty easy. But I don't see this team first year in the SEC going into Kyle Field, going into Samford, or winning either of those games. So I think 10-2 is fair because I think they're dropping 2 of either Michigan, A&M, or Georgia, and it's which 2 of those they're going to drop. I just went with Georgia and A&M, but they're a 10-2 team. Write that in pen. That 10-2 is happening. And then 11-1 Alabama here. I hate to do it, obviously as an Auburn guy, but I think they're not going to be the Bama that we've known under Saban in the future, in my opinion. But I don't think that's going to happen this year because they have so much talent returning. Milroe, Malachi Moore, Tyler Booker, Caden Proctor. They're going to be good again. They're going to be very good again. You bring in a guy like Overton, former 5-star. Damani Jackson, former 5-star. Jeremy Bernard's a solid player. You do lose Arnold. You lose McKinstry. You lose Turner. That's a lot of defensive talent you lose, but they seem to always replace it. And for losing Nick Saban, they were able to salvage a lot of their talent. It'll be interesting to see how DeBoer does. I think he's a good coach. I'm skeptical of if he's a great coach, but that's a future topic. For this year alone, they're a super good team. And I think they win their non-conference games. Maybe at Wisconsin, that's a tester. Camp Randall's a tough place to play, but they're going to win that game. Home against Georgia, week 4, comes early this year. DeBoer's not ready for that. He's losing to Georgia. It's not going to happen. At Vandy, they win that. South Carolina win, and then I do think. It wouldn't shock me if they drop one of Tennessee, LSU, or Oklahoma, but I just couldn't pick which one, and I was like, a team's got to go 7-1, and I feel like between Ole Miss, Bama, Texas, Missouri, I was like, Bama's the best team. They're going to go 7-1. I hope they drop that last game of the season for sure, but in Tuscaloosa, they're probably winning that one. So we'll get past them quickly. 11-1, another good year for Bama. But they're not better than the number 1 team in the SEC. And the number was wrong there. I need to fix that here. 12-0. Don't get it twisted. This Georgia team they're not going anywhere. 12-0. I had to fix that because I didn't want you guys getting mad at me. The schedule is brutal though. I mean, Clemson neutral site, at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. But this team is so good. This team is through and through the best team in college football. I think they were the only team anywhere close to Michigan last year, and they won the 2 titles before that. Kirby just has this thing rolling like a machine, and it's tough to see them not winning the SEC and not going undefeated this year. Yes, they lost talent. Yes, they lost Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, Kamari Lassiter. But when you compare that to the other teams like Alabama, those losses aren't that bad, and you have guys like Beck, you have Malachi Starks, you have Ernest Green, you have Michael Williams. The list just goes on and on for how good this team is. I mean, their offensive line could all be like top 2-round picks next year. It's like this team is so loaded, and they win it from within the trenches. Yes, their skill position talent is good. That's the one question I have with them is where is that Brock Bowers level guy coming from? Where is Ladd McConkey coming from? Like, where are those get it done, skill position guys coming from, but I don't think it matters because you have that line, you have Trevor Etienne, and you have Carson Beck who will just dissect you from the pocket. He is such a good pocket passer. I know he doesn't do a ton out of structure, but he's not going to put the ball in harm's way. He's going to stay on schedule with that running game, with that dominant offensive line that they always have year in, year out. And they have Trevor Etienne, who's the best running back they've had in the last couple years. So I think that's very good. I think London Humphreys could maybe be that Lad McConkey type, but I think he needs another year. Ellis Robinson, number one corner. In last year's class, they obviously had the number one recruiting class last year. No reason that this team won't be the number one team in the SEC. They have the best quarterback in the SEC in my opinion. They're a rival of Auburn, but I'd rather see them win than Alabama. So we get to the SEC championship game, and like every year, it's Alabama, Georgia. But I think Georgia wins pretty handily. I think they rely on that run game early. I think they score 1-2 touchdowns quickly, and next thing you know, it's halftime and it's 17-0 or something. They just can get on you quick and just eat away the clock because of how good they are in that run game. And then their defense with Starks and Williams, like Small Munden, another name. I mean, I could make that whole entire list of returning players, and like half of them are going to be first-round picks next year. Like their roster is loaded. So Georgia wins the SEC. They go 13-0. They're likely the number one seed going into the playoffs, depending on what the other conferences do. But they're a playoff team. I see no way that they don't win double-digit games this year. And I'd say if you're letting me pick the field versus Georgia for who wins the SEC, I'm probably taking Georgia. I think they're a tier above everyone in the conference with returning talent, with adding guys from the portal, number one recruiting class. I mean, there's no reason that they won't win. And I just don't think the other teams have the talent to match up. Quickly run through some awards. Offensive Player of the Year, it's going to be Beck. I don't think he's the best offensive player in the conference. I'd probably give that to Luther Burden. But it seems like Offensive Player of the Year, they like to favor quarterbacks, and rightfully so. If Beck leads Georgia to 13-0 and he could win the Heisman, he's going to win SEC Offensive Player of the Year. Defensive Player of the Year, I know I was going crazy over him earlier. Nick Scourton. I'm kind of predicting like 15 sacks this year. I mean, this dude's a freaking beast. So I think it's either going to be him or Walter Nolan probably. So either way there. Special teams player of the year, I don't know. I chose Bert Auburn. Gotta love the hair. But I'm not gonna act like I know kickers. I don't know. Bert Auburn. We'll just go with him. Freshman of the year, Cam Coleman. I had to get a biased pick in there somehow, but I don't think that's a crazy take. I don't think they have like betting odds for this, but he might be number one on a betting odds list because he has the perfect storm going. To be freshman of the year, you have to be talented enough to get on the field. Check. He was the number 8 overall recruit in the country at a position of need for Auburn. That's the second thing. You have to be able to get playing time. There's guys at Georgia, Ellis Robinson, super great player, but he's not going to be able to get on the field because Georgia has so many upperclassmen better. Whereas at Auburn, Cam Coleman from day one might be the best receiver on the team, and as a 19-year-old, he might just have 1,000 yards or something. Like I think it's a biased take, but I don't think it's crazy. Jacobs blocking trophy. I didn't know that was a thing, but I looked it up and I was like, sure. Will Campbell, best offensive lineman in the country, best offensive lineman in the SEC. Sure. Coach of the year. I don't know why that says Lane Kiffin. Because earlier when I had them making the SEC championship, I gave it to Lane Kiffin. But we're gonna again fix this because I don't want to see Lane Kiffin's name next to that. We're gonna sadly give it to this guy. As much as I hate to do it, Kalen DeBoer, first-year head coach, leads them to an 11-1 record. Have to do it. We'll get past that quickly. All SEC offense, quarterback Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers. No debate there. 2 best quarterbacks probably in the country, and they both play in the SEC. Jarquez Hunter, and maybe a little biased take, but I think you ask a lot of SEC coaches, him and Trevor Etienne are their most feared guys that they have to face this year. Ruben Owens, former 5-star, I want to say. And then Rocket Sanders, I talked about him earlier. I don't know why it says Mississippi State. He went to South Carolina. Um, Isaiah Bond, Luther Burden, I said those are the two best receivers in the SEC, and they play with great quarterbacks. No reason they won't put up numbers. Trey Harris, again, go watch the Texas A&M highlights. Kyron Lacey, he's an LSU receiver. What do you want me to say? He's going to be good. Caden Priestcorn, again, second best tight end in the country, probably, at least in the draft next year, behind the Colston Loveland from Michigan. Amari Nyblack, talented and plays in a system that likes tight ends that produced JT Sanders last year. So, like that for him. Offensive line, Will Campbell, top 10 pick. Kelvin Banks, top 10 pick. Tyler Booker, first round pick. Xavier Truz, Eli Cox, both guys are going to get drafted next year. Caden Proctor, future first round pick. Emory Jones, along with Will Campbell on that line, will be very good. Ernest Green, first round pick. DJ Campbell, Jake Slaughter, both guys that will get drafted for sure. So just kind of went with the top draft guys there. I'm not going to act like I am some offensive line genius and have been watching all these guys. I just kind of went, okay, who's going to get drafted next year? They're probably going to be all SEC players. So don't buy too much stock in that. All SEC defense here, defensive line, James Pierce, Nick Scourton, Deion Walker, Michael Williams, all freaks of nature, all guys going in the first round of the draft. Pretty safe bet that they will be on that defensive line, all SEC. And then Princely, I don't want to say that name any more than I have to. He's going to be good. Shamar Turner is going to be good. And actually, I forgot to put what's his name? Walter Nolan on here. Walter Nolan, I would say, is going to make it over Michael Williams, and then drop off Landon Jackson, I guess. Drop off Asante, as much as I hate to do it. It's probably going to be him. But yeah, those are the 8 best defensive linemen in the SEC. Harold Perkins, freak. Danny Stutzman, awesome. Anthony Hill, awesome. And Stutzman, that's the Oklahoma guy, if I'm not wrong. I got the schools messed up again on there. But whatever. Debo Williams, probably going to put up 200 tackles this year. Small Munden, best linebacker in the country. De'Aric Jackson, very good linebacker for Kentucky. Malachi Starks, first-round pick. Maxwell Hairston was all SEC last year. No reason he won't do it again. Dalen Everett, probably a first-round pick. Billy Bowman, very good playmaker for Oklahoma. Malachi Moore, probably a first-round pick. Zai Alexander, don't know much about him, but was high rated on some draft boards. So I was like, yep, it'll be good. Toriano Pride, very good player for Clemson, transferred into Missouri. Damani Jackson, former 5-star, transferring in from Alabama. Seems like their safeties always blow up. And again, I messed this up so much. Small Munden is at 2 positions, but he's that good. So sure, he can be it for DB. And then Jason Marshall, a good player there for Florida. So that is all. I know that was a lot to go over. I just want to give those SEC ones quickly, try to get out of here quick. But again, if you want to run down, Georgia is your SEC champ against Alabama. Georgia's the best team in the conference, and they're in a tier with probably one other team, in my opinion, that we'll talk about later, of the 2 best teams in college football. So yeah, they're going to win the SEC. They're going to be a top 2 seed in the country, in my opinion. 13-0. It's probably happening again for them. So yeah, go Dogs, I guess. But that is going to wrap up the video. I know this was very long. If you stuck with me all the way to the end, credit to you. You're a football diehard like me. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.